Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to EIE Radio, equipping, inspiring, and encouraging Christians to stand for truth and reach the lost. And now here's your host, Neil Hess. Well, hello everyone, or anyone who happens to be listening to this. This is the very first show of the EIE Radio podcast, and I wanted to take a few moments to introduce the show and introduce myself to let you know a little bit about me and a little bit why this show exists. So the tagline for the show, why this broadcast exists, is to equip, inspire, and encourage Christians to stand for truth and to reach the lost. And along the way, I'm hoping to engage quite a few skeptics as well to interact with them and to get their point of view on the various issues that we will be discussing. So what do I mean by equip, inspire, and encourage? Well, if Christians are going to stand for truth, stand for biblical truth in their lives, and also reach out to the lost people in the world, we need to be properly equipped. And by equipped, I mean we need to know the Bible, like it's the back of our hand. We in America, a lot of American Christians have not done a good job, myself included for a long time, of really knowing the scriptures for ourselves and spending a lot of time in it. And we need to make sure that we are properly equipped with knowing about the Bible. It's sad how many times I'm out with doing evangelism and coming upon people who identify themselves as Christians really have very little understanding of the core message of Christianity, don't really know any scriptures beyond John 3:16, and couldn't really defend their position. And so I want to make sure that people are properly equipped, that they have the understanding, they have the knowledge, they have the background that they need to engage the culture in a meaningful and thoughtful way. And this podcast also exists to inspire Christians as well. I want to inspire people to, with stories, to realize that God has given His Holy Spirit to believers and that we are capable of so much more than we usually think. We just need to have faith and remember that Almighty God is with us, and we're not going to accomplish necessarily everything we set our minds to just because it's not part of His will, but we can accomplish a whole lot more than I think a lot of us think we can. And then also to encourage. In this battle, standing for truth and reaching the lost, it's really easy to get discouraged, especially if you watch the news on any kind of regular basis. It's so easy to get discouraged when we look at the news around us. I know I personally, as a Christian, am very discouraged by the political candidates for president at this point in time. With Mitt Romney, for example, I believe Mormonism is false. I believe it is not a true religion, whereas Mormons would believe Orthodox Christianity is not a real religion, or not a true religion at least, because they make contradictory claims. And so I would, I do have reservations about, or I would have reservations for voting for Mitt Romney because of that. Also, I have great reservations against voting for Barack Obama as well, because of the many unchristian stances he takes, the pro-choice or pro-abortion stance he has, and the pro-redefining of marriage stance that he has taken recently. So I have reservations for that as well. So it's easy for us to get discouraged. I didn't mean to go off on a political tangent there, but it's easy for us to get discouraged in lieu of all the negativity we see going on around us. So I want to provide some stories, some testimonies, some things like that to help us in those times of need when we're really kind of down. Because I know that in my life, when I've heard testimonies from Christian brothers and sisters that, hey, I saw this happen, or I was able to witness to this person, we made lots of progress. It's just been so encouraging to hear those. And I think we need those sometimes, like a little booster shot for our souls. So I want to make this podcast a mixture of giving you information, inspiring you with ideas or new techniques, and then also encouraging you with stories that will help boost your spirits, so to speak, in our battle to stand for truth and to reach the lost. we must stand for truth. Proverbs 25:26 says that if the godly give in to the wicked, it's like polluting a fountain or muddying a spring. So we are called biblically to stand for righteousness, to stand for truth. That doesn't mean bullying people. It doesn't mean beating people up. It doesn't mean withholding positive interactions or whatever else from people who disagree with us. But it means that we take a firm stance for truth, for God, for Scripture, for Jesus in this world, regardless of the repercussions it might have. And then also, we must reach the lost, because the commission at the end of Matthew and the end of Mark and all throughout tells us that we must reach out to the lost. We must share the gospel with others. It was the very last thing Jesus said to his disciples before he left earth. And I think we need to take that seriously. If I knew that I only had one shot to tell somebody something before I left, I died or whatever else, I would want to make sure that that was something very important, very meaningful, and we see Christ did that with us. He left us the Great Commission to reach out to save souls. So we need to take that to heart and find various ways of sharing the gospel with other people. I also wanted to take a few minutes just to share my personal testimony. I'm 29 years old. I live in Hillsboro, Oregon with my lovely wife, Jennifer. I'm a middle school teacher at a local middle school, and I love working with kids. It has been such a joy for me to work with kids. There's so much. It's such a joy to see them, grow and develop, and the funny little things they do. There isn't a day I go to work where I don't end up laughing at something they do, because they're just very funny. It can also be a very disheartening job, though, too. It comes with lots of challenges, both from interacting with students and parents, and sometimes the district. Not that I'm complaining, but it just has its challenges, and dealing with dozens of children a day who all have various needs and backgrounds and issues to focus on. So anyway, I grew up in what you would call for the most part, a nominal Christian household. My mother was and is a true believer. She converted when she was in college, and my father grew up going to church, although he was a nominal Christian until just a couple of years ago, actually. He had a very profound change of heart and conversion experience just a couple of years ago, and it's been really neat to see his growth, and has been a big encouragement to me. Like I said, I was a nominal Christian for quite a while. I went to college and got into, the typical kind of party lifestyle at college, just filled with all sorts of sin and not living as I should have. However, I had lots of guilt throughout college, though, as well. There was a lot of underlying guilt for some of the things that I'd been involved in, things I'd done. And I felt conviction about those things for a long, long time. And so I moved from University of Nevada, where I was going to college, and I moved to Portland, Oregon to do graduate school for education. And so I was in graduate school and going through learning how to become a teacher and have to know. And I was doing student teaching out in Scappoose High School, and I was walking through the classroom one day and speaking with a young lady who I developed a good relationship with, and just talking to her about whatever. And she brings up her grandmother. And she tells me this story that her grandmother had passed away on the operating table. And she's conveying this story to me. Her grandmother passed away on the operating table, had gone and seen Jesus, and Jesus told her, "It's not your time." And the grandmother came back to life after being dead on the operating table. When this young lady told this story to me, it had a huge impact on me for some reason. I've heard near-death experiences before, and, I found them interesting, but it had not had an effect like this. When she told me this story, when she told me that her grandmother come back and Jesus said, "It's not your time," I felt what can only really be described as like a push on my chest. Like something was pushing against my chest, and it took my breath away almost. And I don't want to say I was seeing things here. It's not like a vision, but it's kind of like this picture in my head, the mind's eye, if you want to call it that I saw Jesus with his arms outstretched and two rows of trees and like the sun rising behind him. And it was just this overwhelming sense of, oh my, like Jesus is real. God is real. This isn't just a story. This isn't something people, believe just for no reason. No, this is real. This is reality. God is real. And it had a huge effect on me. So I went home and I told this. I was living with my parents at the time when I was going to graduate school. I went home and I told this to my mother. My mother said, start reading through the Gospels. And so I read through some of the Gospels, not as much as I should have. I still would get into the Bible more than I daily basis. I started going through the Gospels and reading, and with a whole new appreciation for it. Just wow, this is real. However, I retained a lot of my skepticism at the same time. I believed and I was very skeptical at the same time. I know that sounds kind of like a contradiction, but if you've ever kind of had the experience I had, I think you know what I mean. And I was like, okay, I believe, but there's a lot of questions I have that need to get answered though too. And so I started investigating a lot of these questions. Like, what's the history of the planet? Is the Genesis story true? Is there reason to believe the Genesis story and the timeline of that? And I'll probably get into the age of the earth on another episode. And I started about other questions like, do people who don't hear about Jesus, do they go to hell? Why do we have all those questions, and especially evidential questions about the resurrection, about the history of the Bible, how it was created, how it was put together, things like that. And I started to realize that there are many very good explanations, and there are very many wonderful lines of evidence to show us that we can trust the Bible. In fact, to not trust the Bible would actually be going against an overwhelming amount of evidence that we do have. And so I just found it to be very reassuring at that point that, wow, there's a ton of good evidence to believe this. And it surprised me that I'd never heard it before. And so since that time, I had been very encouraged and just had a huge desire to get it out there to people that, hey, there's really good reason for us to believe this. We shouldn't be afraid of science. We shouldn't be afraid of evidence. We shouldn't be afraid of thinking philosophically when our presuppositions aren't grounded in naturalism. What I mean by that is when we don't start off with the idea that only matter or only material stuff exists, because there's plenty of good, logical, reasonable lines of evidence for us to think that, hey, you know what, there are things beyond the material world. And so I was just fascinated by apologetics and evangelism, and I really got into it, and I've been into it ever since. And so based on the fact that my testimony, my conversion, was based largely around a near-death experience, or the conveying of near-death experience to me, I wanted to go through in this first episode just what near-death experiences are, what facts we have about them, shown about them, and some various other things about them. So some near-death experience facts. And this is from the website IANDS. If you do Google search for them, you can find them, and there's lots of documentation to back up the statements they're making. So here's some of the statements they make at IANDS. I believe it's .com or .org. I can't remember which off the top of my head. So some facts. A near-death experience, I'm just going to say NDE from now on because it's a lot easier, is a profound psychological event that may occur to a person close to death, or if not near death, in a situation of physical or emotional crisis. Because it includes transcendental and mystical elements, an NDE is a powerful event of consciousness. It is not a mental illness. So it's important to remember that it is an event of consciousness, that this isn't a hallucination or a mental illness or something like that. This is the still perceiving things. Surveys taken in the United States, Australia, and Germany suggest that anywhere from 4 to 15% of the population have had near-death experiences. You probably know at least 10 people who have had an NDE, but they just might not talk about it. And the way I figured that, I read a book a while back about a businessman who realized that every person knows around 250 people, if you take into account family, friends, coworkers, stuff like that. Everyone knows about 250 people. So if out of those 250 people you know, 4% of them have had a near-death experience, it's about 10 people at least. 1/4 of the 800 people who have submitted an account of their experience to IANDS Online reported that they were not close to death or clinically dead at the time. Instead, they were in an emotionally intense situation, praying or meditating, sleeping, or state of consciousness when the phenomenon occurred. The IANDS organization refers to these as near-death-like experiences, or NDLEs. So this isn't really someone who's near death, but they're having a very traumatic experience that gives them an NDE-like experience. 75% of those who sent their accounts had a sense of being close to death, were in a life-threatening situation, or believed they were actually clinically dead. Also, a large study conducted in the Netherlands showed that 18% of people who suffered a cardiac arrest and were clinically dead had later reported an NDE. Now, at this point, a skeptic might say, well, what about the other 82%? Well, we need to remember that just because not everyone experiences an NDE doesn't mean that the ones who do experience it aren't having a legitimate experience. So just because some people aren't having that same scenario, people who do doesn't discount. This isn't necessarily something universal that everyone who dies and resuscitated experiences. So just because some people aren't having them doesn't mean the ones who are imagining or making something up. There's some interesting correlations that they had reported here too. They found that there was no significant correlation that was found between religious beliefs and the likelihood of the depth of the near-death experience. There is no significant correlation that has been found between age, race, sexual orientation, economic status, and the likelihood, content, or depth of the near-death experience. No correlation between life history, beliefs, behavior, or attitudes of a person and the likelihood of having a radiant or harrowing NDE have been established, and there's no evidence of a correlation between the means of coming close to death, including suicide, and the likelihood of having a harrowing NDE. So, the main breakdown of all this information here is that it goes beyond racial, sexual, religious backgrounds. It's a universal experience. It's not just someone experienced by, Southern white people, for example. This is something that occurs universally, not to every person who, has cardiac arrest, for example, and comes back, but it's across all these boundaries. We find them all over the world in all sorts of different backgrounds. Now you may be thinking to yourself, okay, well, it's all well and good, but how do we know that they're just not making all this stuff up? I mean, how are we going to be able to scientifically document that their consciousness is actually experiencing these things versus just hallucinating it? Well, there are some instances that have you can actually verify some of the experience that they've been having. So there's a very famous case of Pam Reynolds. I'll just read the breakdown here for you. In order to remove a life-threatening aneurysm deep in her brain, Pam Reynolds underwent a rare surgical procedure called Operation Standstill, in which blood is drained from the body like oil car, stopping all brain, heart, and organ activity. The body temperature is lowered to 60 degrees. Remember, our body temperature is normally 98.6 degrees, so they dropped her body temperature 38 degrees. Hypothermia sets in when our body's only dropped a few degrees, so she is in a very, very, very different state of body, very, very different body state at this point. While fully anesthetized with sound-emitting earplugs, Pam's ordeal began. Dr. Speltzer, I believe that's how you pronounce it, the surgeon was sawing into her skull when Pam suddenly heard the saw and began to observe the surgical procedure from a vantage point over his shoulder. She also heard what the nurses said to the doctors. Upon returning to consciousness, she was able to accurately describe the unique surgical instrument used and report the statements made by the nurses. Now, it's kind of a little bit misleading here. Returning to consciousness is not a material phenomenon. We see material results of the phenomenon, like us being awake, us being able to talk, hear, see, smell, taste. But consciousness is an immaterial thing. Now, I know there's plenty of naturalists who would argue against that, but I believe there's plenty of good evidence to support that statement. And remember, her body was, again, 38 degrees before normal. All the blood was drained and they were sawing into her brain, so she was definitely not in a normal state of consciousness. There's also a report from a Dutch nurse. During a night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old comatose man into the coronary care unit. When we go to, this is a statement from the nurse, when we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I remove these upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. Only after more than a week do I meet with the patient, who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he says, "Oh, that nurse who knows where my dentures are." I'm very surprised. Then he says, "You were there when I was in the hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them onto that cart. It had all these bottles on it, and there was a sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth." So this man was comatose. He was just totally out of it, and yet he was able to describe. He knew the nurse. He knew that she took his dentures. He knew where she put the dentures, and he was also able to describe the cart the dentures were put in. This was all while he was in a coma. I don't know how you would explain that from a naturalistic perspective, from a perspective that only material things exist. Visual perception in the blind. Dr. Kenneth Ring describes 21 cases of visual perception in the blind during their near-death experiences in his book Mindset, Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind. So these three are pretty impressive cases, and there's one more case that I want to share with you that was from Dr. Gary Habermas. And if you haven't read Gary Habermas's book on evidence for the resurrection, I can't recommend it enough. You need to read it. So here's Dr. Gary Habermas talking about a specific case of a near-death experience. As soon as it cues up. Oh, come on now. Well, Gary Habermas, if you haven't read it, I would highly suggest you go to his website, GaryHabermas.com. It's a fascinating wealth of resources on all sorts of things. He talks about the resurrection, near-death experiences, and some of his debates. His debate, particularly with Anthony Flew, is very, very fascinating. You can get that on YouTube.
Flat brainwave case is, I think, the second case on your sheet there. And it's a little girl from Idaho who was called at the time Katie. This has been written up in at least 2 different journal articles, at least 2 different medical journal articles, Journal of Pediatrics and a second journal. She was taken to a hospital room after she was underwater for 19 minutes. Now it doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize that her heart or brain wasn't working after being underwater for 19 minutes. But when they got her to the emergency room, they continued to check her vital signs later, got her out of the water, rushed her to the hospital room, to the emergency room, and worked on her. Now, the pediatrician who worked on her, he's cited on the back, his name is Melvin Morris. He was an agnostic. And, it's not enough today to be a pediatrician, right? You have to have a subspecialty and a subspecialty. This guy was a brain specialist pediatric doctor, and he was doing the work in the emergency room that night. So here's this pediatrician who has all this research on brain states, and here Katie is brought in, being underwater for 19 minutes. Her eyes were profoundly comatose. She was profoundly comatose. There's no eye movement and no brainwave activity. They worked on her in the emergency room and couldn't do anything else for her and hooked her up to machines in ICU. And 3 days later, she spontaneously came to. Now, I say spontaneously because they didn't do anything else to her except keep her alive. They weren't doing any incredible efforts to bring her back. She was in ICU hooked up. And she came to, and Melvin Morris came in. I've had several conversations with him. We've talked for a few hours. And he said, imagine my interest. When she looked up, when she first came to, and she looked up and she said, "Oh, you're that kind doctor who resuscitated me. Thank you." And she said, "Where's the tall, thin doctor without a beard?" And he said, he's right down the hall here. I'll get him for you. And now she had been profoundly comatose is his phrase, no brainwave activity this whole entire time while the two men were working on her. He went and got this medical doctor. They came in the room and sat there. I think he said it took them 1 hour to hear her story about what happened to her the last 3 days. And they're feverishly scribbling notes. And here's what she said. She said, first of all, I watched you when I was in the emergency room, and I was up above, and I could see what you were doing, and I could see different things in the room. Okay, well, what's the emergency room look like? Well, this is over here, and this is over here, and this is over here, and this is red, and this is silver, and this is this, and you guys did this to me, and then someone did this to me. And she's describing this process, and totally, awed these guys. And then she said, an angel named Elizabeth came and got me, and I went off with Elizabeth. Okay, there's no test for angels named Elizabeth, but she said that Elizabeth allowed her to look into her home that night and see what her parents and siblings were doing. No brainwave activity, profoundly comatose, and she said, I watched my parents. My dad came in the house, and he sat down over here, and he was staring straight ahead, just staring. She said, brother and a sister. They were upstairs. She told what the brother was playing with. She told what the sister was playing with. She told about a popular song that came on the radio that her brother was humming, and she named the song. And she said, my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. And Dr. Morris, he's getting his pen out, taking notes. He says, there's a contact point with the world. What did your mom make for dinner? And she said, roast chicken and rice. Roast chicken and rice. And when the family came in, he said to the mom, what did you make 2 nights ago for dinner? The night all this is happening. And to the father, what were you doing inside the house? And to the kid, what did you go up and play with? And do you remember the song that came on the radio? And to the daughter. And she was right down to the exact detail. Now again, there's no test for Elizabeth, the angel, but she's reporting things that are going on in the world while she's strapped down on a table, hooked up to machines, profoundly comatose
without brain waves. That's what he was going to finish, but the clip got cut off. So that, to me, is incredible evidence. And now skeptics might say, well, aren't they hallucinations? And the is that hallucinations are logical, fleeting, bizarre, and distorted, where the vast majority of NDEs are logical, orderly, clear, and comprehensible. And sometimes they will talk about a lack of oxygen to the brain. That's been debunked as well, in showing that actually NDEs had higher oxygen levels than non-NDEs. And there's also there's also an argument that locations in the brain have been found to produce NDEs. Well, they might have been found to produce something like NDEs, but how that can possibly produce the kind of evidence that shows us is, I just couldn't think of any naturalistic explanation. So the conclusion that I've come to, based on hearing the evidence, there is no possible way that someone who is comatose, someone who is very out of it, someone who has no sign of life or consciousness, is going to be able to tell us these objective details that we see here. There's just no way for it. I can't see anyone who can explain that to me from a naturalistic point of view. So that's all for this week, folks. I'd like to thank you for listening and encourage you to please call in to future shows. I would love to dialogue with you if you have a difference of opinion with me. So until next week, I would encourage you to go out there to stand for truth and to reach the lost. God bless you. Take care, friends.